Divisions emerged at the Munich Security Conference this weekend as leaders from the U.S. and Europe differed on their foreign policy strategies. On Saturday, Vice President Mike Pence called on allies in Europe to join the U.S. by pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal.
The time has come for our European partners to stop undermining U.S. sanctions against this murderous revolutionary regime. The time has come for our European partners to stand with us and with the Iranian people, our allies and friends in the region. The time has come for our European partners to withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal and join us as we bring the economic and diplomatic pressure necessary to give the Iranian people, the region, and the world the peace, security, and freedom they deserve.
Pence also echoed President Trump's claims that ISIS is defeated and criticized fellow member nations of NATO. Olivia Gazis attended the conference. She's a CBS News intelligence reporter. Olivia, how was Pence's call to withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal and his criticism of NATO received by European leaders?
I think the consensus description that emerged following Pence's remarks was that his appeal was something like tone deaf. And that's for a few reasons. For one, the Europeans' position on this is relatively well known. In fact, just a few weeks ago, France, Germany, and the UK created something called a special purpose vehicle to allow them to sidestep U.S. sanctions and facilitate some trade with Iran. Secondly, European diplomats at this very conference had already made their position pretty clear. The EU foreign policy chief, Federica Mogherini, had said just the day before Pence's remarks that the EU was committed to preserving the Iran deal and that it was fundamental to the bloc's security. And German Chancellor Angela Merkel was a bit more circumspect in her remarks, but also said there was value in preserving that deal. And finally, Pence made a very similar set of remarks just a couple of days ago in Warsaw at a separate convening of diplomats to foster some agreement on the approach to Iran. But I spoke to one Western diplomat who said his remarks there and in Munich were almost identical, and they sounded almost recycled. And as a result, they were maybe doubly unpersuasive.
Olivia, Iran's foreign minister rejected Vice President Pence's call for Europe to leave the nuclear deal and issued this challenge for the EU. Listen to this.
Europe needs to be willing to get wet if it wants to swim against the dangerous tide of U.S. unilateralism.
Olivia, do America's European allies agree with Iran that the U.S. is trying to force policy unilaterally?
Well, you saw in that speech that the foreign minister certainly came out swinging. He called Pence's speech a farce and arrogant, and yes, he accused the Trump administration of trying to cut its own path and to urge Europeans to, in his words, violate international law by leaving the Iran deal. I don't think that on the whole Europeans were particularly swayed by his remarks, which, were pretty strident and combative, but there was certainly a sense that, not just on the Iran deal, but on a number of other issues, including withdrawing military support from Syria and Afghanistan, leaving behind a decades-old nuclear arms treaty with Russia, and generally consulting with European allies less before deciding on a course of action. It's fostered this sense that America's interest in multilateral agreements and institutions and cooperation has waned under the Trump administration. And, this sort of suspicion before the president entered office that, America would be governed sort of capriciously and by tweet, there's a sense that that kind of has been realized.
As you know, former Vice President Joe Biden also attended the conference where he gave support for NATO. He also emphasized America's need to work with its allies. Let's listen.
The America I see does not wish to turn our back on the world or our allies, our closest allies. Indeed, the American people understand that it's only by working in cooperation with our friends that we are going to be able to harness the forces of a rapidly changing world, to mitigate their downsides and turn them to our collective advantage.
Does it seem like the global community still has faith in the U.S., even if not its current leadership?
It's such an interesting question because, the former vice president, and we should also point out potential presidential candidate, did take this very overt step of saying at this on the world stage, don't worry, this is all temporary. And, he said, we'll be back. All of this will pass. And, that was by this audience, which has gotten used to a certain predictability associated with a rule-following United States. It was warmly received. Because even if there were policy disagreements and personal tensions with previous administrations, there was nonetheless this sort of institutional knowledge of how to operate between, the U.S. and Europe to interact sort of in tandem. And there was at one point an expectation that President Trump, who does pride himself on being unpredictable and has enjoyed some policy success in being unpredictable, there was an expectation that he might be reined in by the so-called adults in the room, Jim Mattis, the former Secretary of Defense, and H.R. McMaster. But with their absence, with their leaving the administration and their replacement with other officials who, like the president, seem to relish questioning the status quo, I think there's a confusion, to not say a suspicion, that the U.S. is simply not interested in being the reliable ally to Europe that it once was.
Well, several other major American politicians attended the conference, including House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Republican Senator Lindsey Graham. Did their messages differ from what Pence said?
That's right. This year, in fact, marked this conference's biggest ever congressional delegation. More than 50 lawmakers descended on it, and one congressional delegation was led by Lindsey Graham. I'm not sure that all of them were speaking with one voice. In fact, I'm pretty sure that the Democrats among them carried a significantly different message than the Republicans, who, were put in the possession of defending or justifying and sometimes just explaining some of the Trump administration's recent policies. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi didn't speak publicly, but she did enjoy this sort of burst of applause when Angela Merkel acknowledged she was there. As we saw, the applause was somewhat more limited for the vice president. Lindsey Graham, who was pressed repeatedly on some of the wisdom and the coherence of the administration's foreign policy choices, seemed to express something like hope that the president would come around and accept some of his, as in Lindsey Graham's, advice, especially on things like Syria. He told an audience that the 50-plus members of Congress had come because, he said, we come because we care. And he acknowledged that he knew the president could be a handful. And I think in kind of a joke, said to a room full of European diplomats, well, you guys can all be handfuls too. And he got some laughs for that.
Some interesting color and details there. Olivia Gazis, thank you so much.
Thanks, Meg.